I hope y'all are enjoying lunch. Just a little bit of housekeeping before Craig takes back over. We have after the EWP panel this afternoon, we have the social here in the same area from 3:45 to 5:30. So please come back and enjoy the social. We have something special today at 3:10 before the EWP panel, so please come in and be able to watch that. That's I got a little reminder last week of something we did back in 2019, and we're going to replay that at 3:10. So that's kind of a teaser, as they say in the radio business, to get you back here at 3:10 so you can see that live here on the screen. As always, we've had this panel since the inception of the South Wireless Summit here in Nashville back in 2014. They always are insightful. They always tell us stuff that we need to know, that we've forgotten over the last many years that we've been in the business. And we really appreciate their diligence and hard work they do on these to get this panel together. I get to attend the calls and get to hear all the great ideas they have. And when you're talking about regulatory, to have great ideas, that's something special. So let Craig go ahead and get introduced.
Okay, folks, hopefully you enjoyed your lunch. And during lunchtime, we're going to have our next presentation. It's going to be the regulatory panel. And the following session is going to start at 1:05 with the tower panel. But on the regulatory panel is Kathleen Eisele, Eric Johnson, Morgan Rasmussen, and Rebekah Fuller. So I'll let them lead the way. Thank you.
Are we on? There we go. All right, very good. Well, thanks everybody for having us this afternoon. We've got a big crowd this year for our regulatory panel, so whether you're just here having some lunch, catching up on some emails, or if you're folks that work with folks in the regulatory realm on a regular basis, hopefully you guys will get something out of the discussion we're going to have here today. The overall theme that we're going to try and weave into the different topics that we've got, because regulatory has all different sorts of facets and areas that it touches, but we're going to try and kind of weave the theme of some things that have been here forever, some things that are changing or new, and then things that remain to be seen as time passes here. So I'm going to start us off with just discussing recommendations, requirements. Sometimes we call those things conditional approvals or special requirements that pop up during the NEPA review process. These have been getting, over the years, a little bit more nuanced. They come from different parties, and so that continues to be something that can be a challenge for applicants along the way. So just going to spend a few minutes talking about how you can address those things and gain clarity along the way. The idea of requirements versus recommendations isn't particularly special to FCC process. There's all sorts of agencies that impact us on a regular basis that have requirements for manufacturers and producers of goods and services that those companies have to abide by, and then there are recommendations along the way that individuals, whether that's a consumer or companies, can choose or not choose to abide by as it best fits them. So kicking it off as far as how do we define and differentiate what a requirement versus a recommendation is? From a regulatory perspective, a requirement's going to be, generally speaking, an action or some sort of process that an applicant has to adhere to in order for their activity or in the case of towers, their facility to be considered compliant. That can be something that's very broad in nature. So Everyone knows if you've got a tower over 200 feet, you must file it with the FCC and the FAA. There's no getting around that. The NEPA review process is a requirement that you have to make sure that you fulfill your obligations for. But there are also site-specific requirements that come into play, and that's sort of where we more often get into the weeds with things. So quick examples of that would be painting antennas to match the color of or the pattern of the building that you're co-locating on to appease or alleviate the concerns of a state historic preservation office, or as many of us are very well aware of here in the southeast, time of year restrictions for wooded areas where we've got protected bat species. Recommendations, on the other hand, are more there to serve most often as guardrails of sorts that could be related to different rules or different laws that may or may not impact your, the facility considerations that you've got to make. So those can often be either at a state level or at a federal level, local ordinances, and anything like that at all. Probably kind of tying back to the theme of things that have been around forever. Migratory Bird and Treaty Act, MBTA, has been here for a long, long time. Those recommendations that are provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service are there to serve as a guardrail so that you are less likely to violate the MBTA. Abiding by those recommendations doesn't mean that you inherently avoid a violation. Not abiding by those recommendations doesn't inherently mean that you will violate the MBTA, but those recommendations are there to simply decrease the likelihood that you end up with some sort of compliance issue as a tower owner. So that seems simple enough on its face, but it gets a little bit more complicated once you actually get into projects. And so there's 3 questions that I think applicants need to make sure they can answer with no uncertain terms, be very clear about these things. The first 2, your consultant should be able to tell you and advise you with, a very high level of certainty along the way. So that's going to be, says who, and the second one's going to be, do we really have to? I kind of hear my 7-year-old asking me about going to bedtime when I ask those questions myself. Says who is it an authoritative source that is giving you this, for lack of a better word, a demand of sorts on the project. There's a big difference between the Fish and Wildlife Service telling you that you've got to limit time of year that you're going to clear for trees at a site versus maybe a local conservancy group or something like that. On one hand, you are going to be looking at a requirement because the Fish and Wildlife Service is somebody that the FCC has advised you have to consult with them and take their feedback into a high level of consideration. In some cases, you have to do what they say unless you can kind of negotiate your way around that or address their concerns otherwise. Whereas a local process or a local group may be somebody you can listen to and consider what they have to say, but does not have the same teeth that a group like State Historic Preservation Offices or Fish and Wildlife Service may have. Once you've got the answers to those first 2 questions, then you've got the third question. Can we do it? Is it feasible? Regardless of if it's a requirement or a recommendation, you've got to make that determination. Your consultants can help you with that process. So there may be circumstances where you've got a requirement, like a SHPO wants you to decrease your tower height by 50%. Might not be feasible just from an RF perspective. So at that point, regardless if that's a requirement, you may have to have some serious considerations about the feasibility of that site. On the other hand, you may have recommendations that, while you don't have to do them, they make really good sense to do potentially. So a hypothetical there could be a site where you've got gopher tortoise burrows all over the place, but not right at your site, so they're not a concern for you now. But you're still going through planning and zoning on the site. And so who knows months down the road when you get that approval, what those site conditions are going to look like. A recommendation to install silt fencing or something, some sort of barrier to keep that species from encroaching on the site may make very good sense and be worth the time and money spent on it on that case. At the end of the day, the one word I kind of, would like folks to leave with as far as when you run into these special requirements or considerations, recommendations, all that, is clarity. You need to know exactly what you're looking at. Paying close attention to the language that comes along with these responses from third-party sources or agency sources is really crucial. And if you don't understand what it says, definitely reach out to your consultant and make sure that's crystal clear, so you understand if you're signing up for something like a time of year restriction that is really crucial for you, as well as avoiding something like not understanding that you've got a requirement in place. Both of those things are very important. Ask for recommendations on how to implement any of those requirements or recommendations. See what it would actually look like. Do a cost-benefit analysis, a risk analysis of what it would look like to implement those items. Another item that's really important and probably where we see most of the actual compliance issues come into play is communication. Clear communication, tracking, making sure everybody that is in place between the NEPA review process to construction knows any of these recommendations or requirements that need to be implemented is very critical. So whether that's a tracking system, I know a lot of people will put things like if you've agreed to monitoring requests, they go on the CDs. Anything like that is really helpful to avoid mistakenly violating any special requirements or items that you've agreed to along the way. And then kind of tying this all together from old to new things, keep in mind the things that you know are in place. At this point, time of year restrictions have been in place for years, and although they change a little bit from here to there, different states will change what their requirements are. If you're working in an area and you've got wooded land, kind of bake that into the cake early on as far as that's a potential requirement that you're going to have to implement, as well as know that every year something new changes. It could be tomorrow that we get a brand new request from either one of these agency sources or a state agency comes in with some new consideration that we've never seen before. So know what's out there, know that things will change, and that'll keep you ahead of the game as far as special requirements and staying out of trouble on those items. So yeah, I don't know if the panel has anything to add to that. They're welcome to, but otherwise, Morgan will take it from here, talking about some other items that have been in play for a little while on the small cell side.
Alrighty, we'll shift gears into the world of small cells and the different exclusions that exist for those projects specifically. So while regulatory policy, I'm sure, is not everyone's favorite lunch topic, we at least have to talk a little bit about some of the rules and policies in place that govern the exclusions that do exist for small cell projects specifically. So just to touch on a few key milestones or high points over the years that the FCC has implemented, we have the 2004 Nationwide Programmatic Agreement, which established a lot of things, but included in that was a limited exclusion specifically for facilities that are either in or within 50 feet of an active utility right-of-way. The 2016 First Amendment to the FCC's co-location agreement really further expanded the exclusions that were kind of catered towards small cell installations. And the FCC's mindset with that amendment was to incentivize co-locating on existing structures rather than pursuing new tower construction. And with that, with the exclusions that are outlined in that regulation, they also put a formal definition to small cells, usually referred to as small wireless antennas, all of us would call small cells. And then in 2017, the FCC adopted a reporting order that established a specific exclusion for the replacement of utility structures. And just for the sake of keeping this presentation simple, I just wanted to note that the exclusions that the FCC does have in place is not always, or not necessarily, a full exemption from regulatory review. There's some where it might be, looking at a more limited scope, and then there are some where, you're looking at being fully exempt from any level of regulatory review. But we're not going to get too specific into that today. So also, for the sake of this presentation, I thought it might be most helpful to kind of focus on, what are the things that you may be able to do, whether it's in your control or not, to potentially maximize the ability to apply regulatory exclusions. Rather than outlining the specific exclusions themselves and boring you with the details over and over, I wanted to just focus on, here's the criteria that you can consider for maximizing or increasing your ability to apply an exclusion and not have to undergo any kind of regulatory review potentially. So first and foremost, if there's the opportunity or ability to co-locate on existing structures, that's definitely huge. There's a pretty wide array specifically for co-locations on non-tower structures. So, just pursuing an installation of that scope rather than going straight to new tower construction is automatically going to kind of give you that benefit on the regulatory end. I mentioned just quickly in the last slide, but the FCC does have specific volumetric requirements in place for antennas and the associated equipment that go on a structure. So being familiar with what those volumetric requirements are, and if you're within the confines of that, you're also opening up an additional ability to apply exclusions to a project. Avoiding new ground disturbance is another key component that kind of comes up or is, repetitive amongst a lot of exclusions. If there are any kind of screening or concealment features that can be utilized where, new antennas or whatever it might be could be placed, that's always something that's helpful to kind of minimize visibility, kind of also along the lines of increasing your ability to potentially not have to undergo a full regulatory review. Proximity to historic resources as well is a big factor that's kind of plays a large role in the exclusions that may be available depending on the installation type. So most of those are kind of the main criteria in relation to co-locations. When it comes to new structure construction or, the replacement of an existing structure, there are still some opportunities to reduce the level of regulatory review that may be triggered. Just looks a little bit different compared to just to strictly co-locating on existing structures. So the main components there are proximity to active utility right-of-ways, the height increase associated in relation to surrounding structures, proximity to historic resources still is kind of a component that's looked at the same way, and then maintaining appearance, specifically in relation to replacement structures, making sure that the height is one factor of the replacement structure, but making sure that the replacement structure kind of mirrors the appearance of the existing structure to kind of minimize that contrast from previous structure to new. And then we have some, what I would call clarification on some, interpretations or understandings that may not be clear to many. I know I hear a lot of people talk about small cell regulations as defining it as being clear as mud sometimes, and then some misconceptions too. So first and foremost, what comes to mind for me is just the use of the word small cell. I think we've all probably maybe used it at some point or heard someone use it. Most often, except for those of us who are directly in the consulting world of regulatory, most of us are just referring to, the general project type, categorizing it as a small cell because it is smaller than, a macro tower, which is not incorrect, but it just reminding yourselves that in the context of the regulatory world, in the FCC's requirements, there is a specific definition for those antenna volumetrics and associated equipment volumetrics for it to truly be considered a small cell. So the moral of the story there is just because it's smaller doesn't mean that the regulatory exclusions that the FCC has in place will, apply. And then tower and non-tower structures are looked at a little bit different in regulatory context. So structures that are built solely for the use of adding or supporting equipment might look a little bit different from a review perspective than structures that were already existing, already in place, and then are going to have telecommunications equipment installed on it. Another kind of point I like to clarify, and that might be overlooked easily in reading the regulations, is that the volumetrics, when you're taking those into consideration for antennas or equipment, that's cumulative. If there are other, if there is other equipment on a structure, that gets factored into those volumetric requirements. It's not always isolated to just a single installation. So that's something that can kind of make or break the applicability of an exclusion. And then evaluating any concealment or screening features, while those features are viewed as oftentimes hiding antenna or equipment or whatever it might be, if those features are proposed in relation to, let's say, adding antennas to a structure, those concealment features, like for example, first thing that comes to mind for me is a shroud up top, a pole-mounted shroud. That shroud or those features also get factored into the volumetrics as well. It's not just the antennas or just the equipment themselves. And then at the end of the day, there are some components of the regulations that, while the FCC has had a really wonderful way of streamlining the Section 106 review process, streamlining their regulations and expectations, there are some parts of it that still today can be a little bit up to interpretation. So I think the moral of the story we can all agree on up here is that, there's so much benefit in engaging your environmental vendors, environmental firms to kind of weigh in on, to provide expertise and guidance, because this is the stuff we look at every day. So definitely, leaning into getting input and making sure that, you are understanding the regulations, what applies, what doesn't apply, and also we're here to help make sure you maintain compliance as well. And that is it for me today. I will let Kathy kind of take the lead. She's going to transition into kind of more of what's to come down the line, same with Rebekah, and talking about BEAD, which I know is a hot topic right now at the moment.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Morgan. Small cell exclusions, I have always said, is one of the harder things that a NEPA consultant does, because there are so many different things that you have to consider and so many different definitions that you need to understand. So thank you. BEAD and NEPA, hot topic. The BEAD funding has been long awaited. We've been hurry up and waiting for 4 years, and now it looks like grants are about to be awarded. I think 52 of the 56 states now have their final proposals approved, and grantees are now signing their grantee agreements and ready to kick off their NEPA vendors, hopefully. So how is BEAD different from other grant programs? So the biggest difference is the structure that NTIA and the state broadband offices are serving as joint lead agencies. And this is a very unique situation that hasn't been done before. Essentially, NTIA has deputized the states to also have responsibility for complying with NEPA, a federal regulation. So because of this setup, we have the states as a grantee, and then you have your individual applicants as these sub-grantees, and everyone has responsibility for complying with NEPA. The roles will be different, and the earlier in your process that you are defining these roles and who is going to take ownership of those steps, the smoother your process will go. For example, your applicant is going to want to have a project design, project maps, engaging a NEPA vendor to start those NEPA reviews and analysis process, and then the state will be overseeing that process. They'll receive the NEPA documentation, certify its accuracy and completion, and then submitting it to NTIA. So everyone is going to need to work together when they go through this process, which will take a couple of months. So how is an NTIA NEPA different than an FCC NEPA? Mostly everyone here is very familiar with the typical NEPA that you're doing for a tower site. When you're working on a NEPA document for NTIA, one of the first things that you're going to need to do is establish your NEPA project areas. You might have a large grant and a very large project that you're doing for NTIA, but you can break that down possibly into a handful of NEPA projects. And they would have to be independent, separate actions and not rely on other parts of the project to be considered a NEPA project area. Essentially, you can't just kind of chunk off, say, part of your installation that might impact wetlands. It might take longer to permit. You can only do that if that is a separate action and that project could stand alone. Otherwise, you have, your NEPA project area has to be one action item. Once you have your NEPA project areas, then you can start going into the elements of NEPA that you're familiar with, but you have a slightly different approach with NTIA. For example, Section 106, you can use the program comments to streamline. NTIA has adopted many of the exclusions from the FCC, FirstNet, and other exclusions that are available to you for these types of projects. NTIA has streamlined the use of their delegation memo that you can utilize for SHPO consultation that will also streamline your Section 106 review. NTIA has released a wealth of information and tools that will help guide you through all of these steps, including efforts that they've taken to work with the state historic preservation offices and U.S. Fish and Wildlife field offices and other federal agencies, so everyone is aware that of NTIA's process, the volume of projects that are coming, and have taken a lot of efforts to streamline these reviews, so the process should go fairly smooth. Section 7 with U.S. Fish and Wildlife consultation, there is a non-federal designation memo that you can use that outlines a lot of these exemptions and things that will have no effect, and then you won't have to go through consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Some of the things like where if there's no ground disturbance, if you're attaching to existing overhead fiber or you're co-locating in conduit underground, all of these things will have no effect, and you won't have to do consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. You will still have to look at all the typical elements of NEPA, wetlands, waters of the U.S., floodplains, and all of that. So NTIA has laid out a roadmap. Like I said, there is a wealth of guidance documents. They have a guidance document, or have probably hosted a webinar on just about every topic to get through this process. But some of the things that you're going to want to do to start off is have a very clear and concise project description. The sooner the subgrantee and applicant has a very well-defined project area, the simpler the process is going to be. You want to, if you can, and as early as possible in your design process, consider these exclusions that are available to you in your design process, and that's also going to help streamline the NEPA review process. You want to engage a NEPA vendor like the folks up here that specialize in environmental and historic preservation. The NTIA has streamlined this process, and on apparent face value, it might look very simple, but you still need SOI qualified personnel working on your projects, and there are still a lot of work that is very specialized, and you want to work with experts early on in your project, especially if you can engage your vendor to assist with a red flag identification where you're identifying any areas of impacts and that you could possibly design to avoid those areas. That's going to go a long way in streamlining your project and getting you to a point where you have shovels in the ground. There are a lot of parties involved, like I mentioned earlier, between the grantee and the subgrantee and your consultants. And communication, just like Eric said earlier, communication is key with everyone, and a kickoff meeting would be a great step, and having open communication throughout your project, getting the guidance from the state broadband officers that have been educated, and even the NTIA federal program officers as they're available, engaging everyone so everyone knows their roles. So I've mentioned designing with exclusions in mind. If you are able, depending on where you are in your project, to keep in mind some of these exclusions in your design, it can also go a long way in the process. If you have a long fiber route and you're engaging your NEPA vendor early on and you've done that red flag identification memo, maybe you can switch to the next street over and avoid wetlands areas or different sensitive resources. That can go a long way in considering these things at the early stage of your project design. Some of the exclusions you're familiar with towers, towers under 199 feet tall, no guide wires, limiting ground disturbance to less than 1 acre. If you're replacing poles in a right-of-way line, less than 20% of the replacements, all of these things are going to be exclusions that keep you at the categorical exclusion level of a NEPA review, which is the simplest and easiest, fastest, hopefully, level of NEPA review. So that CADEX, categorical exclusion level, is where you want to try to keep your project design. So to do so, you want to avoid those extraordinary circumstances. You want to avoid areas with sensitive resources, critical habitat. If you don't want to add, maybe new poles in an area within a historic district or historic properties. You don't want to have adverse effects to historic properties. You want to avoid significant changes to water bodies, wetlands. There are, all of these things that you can do to avoid extraordinary circumstances. If you can't fully avoid is always what we want to do, right? If you can't avoid, then you do want to minimize or mitigate impacts to sensitive resources. And you can utilize best management practices to still keep, you might be in areas with these resources, but by utilizing best management practices have little effect on these resources. And that still keeps you at that categorical exclusion level of review. So it's a lot of information. NTA has put out a lot of information, and it can be overwhelming. But I would say some of the key takeaways for NEPA compliance is avoid if possible, if you can avoid, minimize and mitigate. Early communication, like everything that we do, that's a lengthy process, especially where regulatory is, involved. Early communication is going to be key. Have these kickoff meetings, do red flag evaluations, have an EHP compliance plan. Know, what your project entails, and work with your vendors to lay out a clear plan on who is going to do what. Start your reviews as early as possible. I mean, we have been waiting, I think, for 4 years for the grant money to start to flow, and now that the grant agreements are getting signed, our phones are starting to ring, and I think it could potentially overwhelm many of the agencies. So the sooner you get ahead of the game and start your Section 106 and Section 7 process before the guy at the table next to you, the better off you're going to be. So start early, start now. And then the last thing is, and just like Eric mentioned earlier, if you have an environmental commitment, make sure you're tracking that and you have a plan in place to comply with that environmental commitment. You don't want to, agree to, all of these things to protect the environment, and then no one's tracking it and making sure it's done. It needs to be memorialized in your NEPA document, and the people that, that are going to be building your project, everyone needs to be aware of how that commitment will be met. So it's a lot. It's a changing world, and there's a lot of information, and it can be a smooth process if you start early and engage the experts that can help you through the process. And a lot's coming. And now Rebekah's going to talk about what is coming. So much is coming.
Before I get to that, I'd just like to add one thing to the bead conversation. I think that for folks in this room, if you are at the early stages, if you've been awarded money and you're utilizing wireless technology, BEAD really, I think, was set up with fiber in mind. Mm-hmm. When it went tech neutral, some things kind of went along with that, but some things still are coming from a position where it's fiber first. And I think establishing NEPA project areas is one of those things that's very much fiber first. I would encourage having conversations with state broadband offices about how you are going to strategize your NEPA project areas if you are an awardee who has a lot of tower sites. Yeah. There's a lot of things that you have to consider balancing. One of them is the administrative lift, because if you are going to have each tower be its own NEPA project area, for example, it's going to require its own NEPA. There are also things to consider about getting through the process quickly. So if you're going to combine towers together within one NEPA project area to try to make that smooth, there's also, you should be thinking about what does that mean then for future co-locations. So if you have 5, 6, 10 towers that are on the same NEPA, does that complicate your future co-locations as well if something pops up? So I think it's really wise to have a conversation early with the state broadband office about what the best strategy is going to be for you and your plan for implementing BEAD.
Yep, absolutely.
So
yeah, there's so many pros and cons. It can really streamline it now, but then could be more complicated later.
Yes, there are so many pros and cons. But thank you. I'm going to switch to talk about what's coming up, and Everybody up here has had a lot of concrete things to say, and my conversation is going to be a little abstract because it's very hard to see into the future. But there are some things that are happening in the broader NEPA regulatory landscape that I think could potentially impact the folks in this room within the next year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. So I want to point out some things to keep an eye on in the near future so that you're kind of aware of it and aren't taken by surprise. But I would also say that your environmental consultants are watching these things very closely so they can assist you in keeping an eye. There has been, I think, conversation in the last few years about NEPA and the value it provides versus what it does in terms of deployment of all sorts of programs, whether it's housing or infrastructure or energy, that sort of thing. Because of that, there's a lot of different things happening all at the same time. There are a lot of conversations happening in congressional committee, and there are some things that are making their way through the legislative process now to potentially impact and change the way we approach NEPA. One of them is the SPEED Act. It passed the House late last year. It's in Senate now. There's, depending on who you ask, some folks will tell you that it's unlikely to make it through the Senate based on how it's currently written, but it could potentially alter dramatically the approach to NEPA. If it actually goes through, if the Senate approves it, it would significantly narrow the scope. So it would redefine undertaking for many projects. It would redefine how we look at effects and how we assess effects for projects. It would limit agencies' review of effects to those things that are spatially and causal, like spatially located near and causal for the project. So for projects that are linear, especially, maybe not so much in this case for wireless folks, that can be a big impact because then you're not looking down the line at what potential impacts can exist there. It would also change how agencies incorporate scientific and technical research in their NEPA reviews. So it would no longer be required that those agencies conduct new research to complete their NEPAs, which is a big difference from where we're at right now, and would potentially have big effects for the ESA and how you approach species and habitat reviews and things like that. They would also not be required to consider outside research, so an agency could potentially limit their NEPA review or considerations to only the research that they have conducted. It would also dramatically reduce how long it takes to get through the CADX process by forcing timelines that are, well, from a practitioner's perspective, really unrealistic, but they would be there. And it would also limit judicial review, so it would prevent folks from being able to overturn NEPA decisions or challenge NEPA decisions, and it would prevent agencies from overturning their own decisions or revoking permits and things like that. So that's one to keep an eye on because I think it's got the potential to have the biggest impact for your environmental regulatory requirements. One that I'm kind of excited about that has made it through the House and is likely to pass the Senate is called the E-Permit Act, which is a procedural act that would create, it would leverage technology to create sort of a NEPA, centralized NEPA hub for all of the federal agencies. So if you are working projects where you have multiple federal agencies, there would be continuity in how they approach NEPA. It would establish some sort of like centralized common definitions and documentation standards. So it would really eliminate a lot of the confusion and the question that comes up when you have multiple agencies involved in a project, which maybe for wireless that doesn't come up very often because most of your projects are just FCC as the lead federal agency. But it would come up if you have BEAD funding. So NEPA, as it currently exists, there are each agency has their own rules for how they do things, but overturning NEPA would require an act of Congress, and Congress is very clearly, through these acts, they're thinking about NEPA, thinking about what they can do to streamline the process and make it easier. Last year, there was an executive order that also asked federal agencies to look at their own NEPA rules and think about what works, what doesn't work, changes that they can make to streamline the process, ways that they can redefine how they handle things, like through undertakings and effects. You may all recall that the FCC started that process last year. They had a public comment period. As of now, nothing more has come of that. I don't know when we can expect some rule changes from the FCC, but hopefully within the next year, I would think you would hear something. I would also keep an eye on the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation. They started a process at their last business meeting to start reviewing Section 106 rules. And then last week, there was another executive order that tasked them specifically to look at Section 106. And right now, they've formed a working group, and that's as far as it's gotten. But at some point, probably in the next year or so, I would imagine there will be a public comment period. Some of the things that they have openly expressed considering is redefining undertakings, so that term could potentially mean that more projects are exempt from Section 106 review. They're talking about redefining or clarifying certain terminology. One of them is the areas of potential effect. So you may know that Section 106 has very good guidelines for direct effects, but the visual effects are a little nebulous. So they're talking about potentially solidifying those definitions as well. And then I have to consult my notes here. Leveraging technology is another thing that they want to consider. I think probably very similar to like the e-permitting act, where they could create a portal for those types of reviews. And then lastly, they're talking about looking at how effects are assessed, so indirect and cumulative effects, which would go back to your visual APE sort of effects, and managing timelines. So I think the ACHP, whatever they come up with for potential rule changes is going to have a big impact for everyone in this room in terms of how you handle Section 106 for your tower projects. And then it feels like from a NEPA practitioner's standpoint anyway, like these regulations are very much in flux and everything is very fluid because there are a lot of conversations that are coming out of the federal government, coming out of these executive orders and things like that. But I think it's important to understand a couple of things. One is that NEPA is a procedural act, which means it kind of establishes how you go about being compliant with something, but the compliance is elsewhere. So regardless of how NEPA changes, there are still obligations for compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act and Clean Water Act and that sort of thing. So you may find yourselves having to lean into your consultants in the coming years to sort of navigate that as kind of the dust settles, for regardless of what happens. And then the last thing I wanted to do was just add sort of a little cautionary tale. It is very important, as things kind of continue to be in flux, that you work on being compliant with what's existing, and you make sure that your NEPA documentation is solid. There have been, in the last 4 months, the Bureau of Land Management and the National Forest Service have had NEPA decisions overturned due to issues with their NEPA documentation. So federal courts are very much still upholding NEPA business as usual as things are going forward. So I think that's especially important for all of you because you want tower facilities to be compliant going into the future as well. So that's it. Thank you.
I know you have to do the NEPA document and then make sure that you utilize it.
Yeah, yes. And that's especially important for BEAD as well, because NTIA has indicated that there can potentially be compliance audits. So there will be follow-up.
You have to save your NEPA document longer than you save your tax returns.
Yes.
Do we have any questions? I know we're probably running over time now, but we are certainly available at any time when we're walking around, or now if anyone has a question. I don't know if we have time or not. Okay, food comas.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.